Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Content Strategy for Software Development webcast, which is being given by Ray Gallen. Ray is with us here today. I think the couple of quick things to get out of the way before we get started. We are recording this event, so there will be a recording available later. That is item 1. Item 2 is that there is a questions tab in the GoToWebinar interface. We use that to take questions from the audience. We do have a large number of people on the call, so everybody except for Ray and myself are generally muted. So do take a moment, if you don't mind, and find your questions tab, because we are going to pause and ask for questions and try and get some feedback from the audience. And the third thing I wanted to mention is that Ray and I, despite being on opposite continents, apparently have the same cold and the same imminent loss of voice. So we apologize in advance for that, and I think we are ready to get started. So Ray, if your voice is up and running, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Sarah, and thank you to everybody for attending. I'll also apologize if I explode in a fit of coughing in the middle of this, and apologize for any inconvenience that might cause, but I'll try and control it. So we're here today to talk about content strategy for software development, and in a certain way it's not really rocket science. If you're familiar at all with content strategy techniques, it's simply an adaptation of them to a situation which is, I think, increasingly common, which is the situation in which software is actually seen as an information-rich environment. We used to have software that would act on content. That's what word processors do, spreadsheets, all those kinds of things. But now we've got software that's doing stuff like communicating medical diagnoses, doing expert systems, helping us even to learn how to speak foreign languages, and even correcting our accents as we do that. So we're talking about software that's much more intelligent and much richer in content, and that has some implications for us as the content producers working with software developers. It means that we need to think fairly globally, first of all, in terms of concepts, and then we need to develop some clear strategies and deliverables that we can work with, and in order to help the partners that we're working with do their work and incorporate our content. So I'm going to cover during this session these two aspects, starting with the notion that when a user is in front of the software, the thing that we ought to be asking that person is, what do you want? You know, why are you here? Why are you in front of this software? And usually the answer is one of these things on this list: to know something, to do something, to explore something, understand, decide, integrate, and combine. And I'll go into those in more detail in just a second. But what all this means from a real practical, down-to-earth standpoint is that people who design and create content have to be involved from day one in a project. We are now, we've been saying this for a long time in technical communication, but it really has become more and more important that we're not just at the end of the food chain chasing engineers around writing down what they said they did, but that we are actually involved in designing the software from the get-go, from day one, because we are, in fact, designers of the software's information subsystem. So we are part of the design team, the development team, just like any other subsystem of software. And I think that's a really critical element of our practice that sometimes we need to, well, it's a point that we need to be able to get across to our management and to our collaborators. We were talking about wanting to know something when we're in front of a software. Some of the things we might want to know: what does this do? How do we do it? How do we use this? What good is it? How do I access its functions? These are things that fit into typical user guidance. We know about this stuff. We also want to do things. For example, we want to do this task or the next task or a different task, or maybe we want to do absolutely nothing new. We want to just keep doing what we've been doing, and we don't want the software to get in our way. We want the software to let us do that. We also need to sometimes explore because we don't know enough about the software. So we want to just know what can the software do or what other people are doing with it. What are my options, for example? What options, if there are, say, add-on options, what have I got? What have I got the right to do? Or what are my options as a user? When I'm at this point in a process, where can I go? There might be several branches where I can go. We need to be able to tell people that. We need to understand things about software, why I want to do this. Now, this is something that is becoming more and more important. Typical user guidance in software has been how you do it. But sometimes people don't have the vaguest idea why it's interesting to do it. And we need to be able to tell them that. Now, telling them that might only be a couple of sentences, but we do need to be able to give them that help. How does it work, obviously, and how what I'm doing fits in with my other activities. Now, here again, other activities doesn't just mean other activities in the software. We don't live only on screen, and we get interrupted. The phone rings. If you're a doctor, you have a patient. If you're working in a company, your boss comes in and tells you something, or a colleague interrupts you. Whatever you're doing, you've got lots of other activities, and your workflow is not exclusively in the software. So how does this fit in with all that? And of course, we need to make decisions. What's important to do next, and what process to use in order to get there. And we need to integrate and combine all that with the exterior. And by exterior, I mean those things which are outside the software itself and which need to connect with either our software-related activities or with the software itself. So that puts us conceptually into a situation where we need to integrate everything that we're doing, and we need to do it seamlessly. So that means user guidance, user interface, sources that we have in the cloud, and of course user interface is important. We have something to say about that, even if we're not the interface designers. We often hear the term expert systems thrown about, and we might be talking about expert systems built into software where the software is the expert, but sometimes the user is the expert. And the software is there to support the user's expertise. All of this leads us to the term decision support. And we have two types that we're working with in software. One is the automated decision support aid, where we go through a tree branching structure and we answer a certain number of questions and the software pops out a recommendation. But we're also providing information designed to inform the user's judgment. And that might not be a formalized automated system, but simply advice of the type that I mentioned before. Why is it interesting to do this? What can you do with this that will help you make decisions? These are some core principles that we need to think about in order to help our users make their decisions. And these come from the U.S. National Research Council. There's a link on the bottom as to where that came from, and you'll be able to access that from the recording. These are worth having a look at. Whatever kind of decision support we're doing, these principles apply. And facing a decision support question or system will automatically put the user in a mindset where he or she needs to organize thoughts and have a clear view of what he or she needs. And we want them to have that, because the clearer they can express that to us, the clearer we can meet those needs. And that's a really important part of our content strategy. So when we get to the nitty-gritty, that is, how do we actually do all these things? What are our strategies? How do we prepare deliverables that can actually be used? We need to remember the three basic phases of a content life cycle: planning, creating, and governing, and start thinking about the fact that our software is also the main face of our organization. We say that, you've heard that said about websites, you've heard that said about all kinds of stuff. If software is the product, if that's what we're selling, then the user has got to, see that as central to what we're doing. And that means that we need to be able to create a strategy that unifies terminology, information, presentation formats, interaction models, whether it's on the web, whether it's in software, in print, in the in every kind of communication. This is a very big task. We're not all going to get to do all of this. We know that. We don't have time, we don't have energy, we don't have bandwidth, and sometimes they don't let us. But we should be thinking of this as an ideal, that everything everywhere should be coherent and integrated. Now, this might be a good place to take a pause and find out if there are any questions, Sarah, so far, or whether people are confused about anything that they need some further elaboration on.
Well, one question that I have is around the issues of crossover between development and content producers. Are you seeing any conflicts there?
Well, there could be. I think in an ideal world, and I have some material on this just a bit later in connection with the deliverables. It's really a team. It's a team effort. The fact that there's someone, say, designing a content strategy doesn't mean that that person is going to be responsible for every, period, comma, and apostrophe that goes into the content. It needs to be shared. Developers, for example, traditionally write things like error messages and so on, but also traditionally, content people vet those and edit them and provide contributions as to how it should be done. Things like terminology. There needs to be agreement between the development team, the content team, marketing, on what the terms are, and that the same terms be used everywhere. Otherwise, people will get confused. So it's teamwork, and teamwork and common sense, really. That answer the question?
I think so, except of course of the problem that common sense appears to be not terrifically common. So
right.
I don't see any other questions coming in. I would encourage you, the many people that are on this call, go ahead and drop those in there as the questions are coming along. And I think we can carry on for now.
Okay. One thing that I think is really important to think about is that when we communicate, there's a lot of, in any normal communication interaction, just even a common conversation, there are all kinds of subtext. There's all kinds of things that are not said directly or explicitly, but which are implied. Like the example I have up here, if I say to you, "You're loud," and then you get softer, it means that somehow I have influence over you. On the other hand, if you ignore me and I don't object to your ignoring me, it means that you have more influence on me than I have on you. Now, when we're communicating with software, we may not think about this sort of thing, but in fact, there's a whole question of what does the software expect of us, and what do we expect of the software, and what is the subtext of all that? And we need to think about that when we're actually creating our editorial content, and that needs to go into our content strategy. And I'll speak a little more on that as we go forward. These strategies are most important as we're going into the planning phase and the creating phase. And I'm going to talk about some specific deliveries that we might want to produce during the planning phase. The content requirements worksheet is my adaptation of a deliverable that Richard Sheffield calls a content or project summary. And it's where you actually just put an inventory of all the stuff that is part of your project. And for me, what differentiates it specifically in software is that you need to really be very clear about the different types of content that need to be produced. For example, the editorial content, the stuff that we as technical communicators are probably most responsible for providing. Also, there's structural content. These are things like messages, error messages, informational screens, and so on. User guidance, tool tips, help screens, and so on, which, again, we probably have a lot to do with. User decision support, that's the why the user might want to do this kind of stuff. Also probably our responsibility. Software interface elements whose main purpose is to be content vehicles. This is things like dialog boxes or tools. Depending on the design of your software, these can take different forms, and I'll show you an example of one in a little bit. But the design of these things is not our responsibility. That's the design, that's the interaction designer or the software people who do that. We need to be able to get in there and work with them on this design so that the containers that they make for us are designed to fit the actual nature of the content. In other words, start with the content and then design your architecture, not the other way around. There is some often in software dynamic content, search results, database content that changes and that's in constant motion. And we might even have live content. By live content, I mean something that we don't directly control, but that it's sucked in from somewhere. We might be creating mashups or feeding whatever the latest content is from a user forum or a social network into some part of our software. And these are things that we also need to think about, especially since we don't control that content. We need to make sure that whoever is moderating that content or curating that content knows where it's going to go and how it's going to be viewed by our users. And so this goes back to the question that Sarah asked just a moment ago, that we're already in the website situation, which is the more typical content strategy situation. We're already blurring to some extent the distinction between content strategy and information architecture. I tend to view them as sides of a coin or parts of a continuous process that is quite important. And again, it might not be done by the same person. That's not the point. The point is that it needs to be done collaboratively in a team so that everybody gets involved in all the different aspects of what's being done. Another deliverable for the planning phase, and this is the one that we hear about the most because it's maybe the most difficult to do, most time-consuming, is the quantitative content inventory. What I've done here is provided an example of just a couple of items as you might do it for software. So again, this is done, this is taken from all the sort of usual content strategy sources. So we'd be looking at, let's say, a home page that's launched when you launch the software. And under that, you might show the user forum. Okay, we know where that comes from. That comes from some sort of URL and is fed in there. But then we also have things like menus, tooltips, and so on. And these are not stored normally these will not be stored typically in our CMS, but in some sort of configuration management system that is managed by the software and by the developers. So we have to know where that is, who is the author, the writer, for example, and who is actually responsible for managing that resource. Same thing when we start getting into things like search results. These are underneath the search results. We have things that are software elements that have content. So this is a hybrid here. This is not just content. This is a container that has a certain behavior that is programmed, that lives in a configuration management system, but that also has content associated with it. And we need to somehow know where all these things are. And again, as content author or content manager or designer, you aren't necessarily going to have direct responsibility or control over all of this, nor would you be able to manage it all if you did. But you do need to have input into how it all gets designed and developed, and to be discussing in the design phase of the software with these people, how are we going to do it and what's the best way to provide it. There are some other planning documents that we want to think about. We need to, besides the quantitative content inventory, the qualitative inventory. This is where we take the same content that we've inventoried on that spreadsheet, and we ask questions about what does it say, is it accurate, is it useful, is it used by your audiences? In other words, is it actually serving a purpose? If this content is not actually used by our users, maybe we should take it out. But at this point, we aren't even going to answer that question. We're just going to answer, is it used? Is it written professionally? I can ask who wrote it. Is the content user-friendly? And these questions, which were developed for websites by Christina Halverson, they work equally well in software. The next step is to drill down deeper and start analyzing the software. And we analyze it in the context of certain questions. Why is this software, or if it's not a new software but a new release of software, why is it being developed? What's its objective? What's its purpose? What is the business goal? How does it fit in with the rest of the company's information environment, like the website, your call center, customer service, your marketing materials, and so on? Does it have a similar look and feel? For example, when the customer jumps from the software to your website, do they see something that looks more or less the same? Can they feel at home? Do they feel that they can relate to this? How did this element come to be created? What is its history? What are the results of its existence? In other words, does it change anything that this content is there? And to remember that the people who are using our software, they're not just using our software. That's not the only thing they're doing. So we need to know what else is out there that influences their behavior and their opinions. So these are questions that we ask at this point. And again, we're not yet making any recommendations. We're just trying to find out, where are we here? And then finally, of course, we need to look at the competition. What are they doing that we aren't doing? And what are they not doing that we might do? Now, this doesn't mean that we should do these things, and we're not answering that question yet. We're just identifying what these things are. We're going to answer the question, should we, in the next phase, which is the strategy document, which is probably the most important thing that we're going to produce in all of this, and it's the most important deliverable. And the strategy document is simply a roadmap from getting to from where we are now to where we want to be when the software is launched. So looking at the competitive analysis, if we found something that they're doing that we're not doing, this is where we start to ask the question, should we be doing it? And the answer might be no. But we need to know that, and we need to know why. If there's something they're not doing that we could be doing, should we? Same kind of analysis. And of course, this has to be dealt with in the context of limitations or restrictions that we might have. If we're working with in a regulated industry such as healthcare, there are regulations or legal constraints that we have to watch out for. We also might have in our company a legal department that has put certain restraints on us. Budget is, of course, always a question. And so how do we achieve our goals in the context of those restrictions. So as we start building these recommendations, and we need to think about that social relationship that users have with the software content. So in terms of the interaction between the user and the software, is the user the authority or is the software the authoritative source? This will change the way that we create the software content as to who is expected to be the actual authority in any of this. What does the user expect from the software? Do we know that? And if we do, we should know that. How can we deliver it? What does the software expect from the user in its design? And is it reasonable to expect that from the user? If it isn't, we need to change the design. And how do we organize and orient our communications so that all of this can be clear, understandable, and user-friendly? All of this implies creating a style guide that's going to help us do that. There are, of course, also practical questions, things like how many languages are we producing this in, what writing constraints do we need to have in order to do this economically and also effectively, and what content management strategies are we putting in place. You might say be putting in a CMS at the same time that you're designing the software. Is the CMS going to be ready and in place? Are you going to be developing software under this CMS, or is it not going to be ready until after you've done this content development? And if it's not going to be ready until later, how do I set my content up now so that when the CMS is ready, I can just plug it in and things can be really quick and easy? Excuse me. What is the process for integrating and structuring the content inside the software itself? And how will users find it? How will they get to it? And just implementation, step 1, step 2, step 3, how do we get from today to launch? Another thing that, if we had more time, I would love to go into in more detail, but that is really important, is that a lot of us work in companies where an agile software process is used. And when you're doing agile, one of the things that happens is there are frequent builds. This content that we're developing needs to be part of those builds, which means that somehow we need to work with software developers and with whatever systems we have in place to make sure that we can automate the incorporation of our content in whatever strategy, in whatever state it's in, so that that content gets sucked into the build automatically without us having to spend time every day doing a build manually, because that's more time than we've got. We're already real busy trying to do what we're doing. So these are things that need to be done collaboratively and coordinated in a group. Then the last bit is the governance questions, and the governance questions are things that we sometimes have problems with. What happens to this content after launch? What's going to define a successful outcome? What metrics are you going to use? And Sarah, I think you've done some workshops on that that subject, in fact, haven't you?
Yeah, we have.
Making sure that also you're going to be able to keep this material up to date. How are you? What process are you going to use in order to make sure that obsolete material gets removed? We tend to be very good at adding new material. We're not so good at getting our old material culled out. And when we take it out, what do we do with it? How do we retain an archival record? How do we make sure that should we need it again, we can get at it? These are curating questions, and these are governance questions. So as we develop this strategy document, we also have to make sure that we've got alignment on this at all levels of the organization. Obviously, if we haven't got this, from the top on down, we're going to have problems downstream. So this is a real critical phase. Now, have we got any questions or comments at this point?
A couple of questions here. You mentioned configuration management systems and, of course, also content management systems. Do you think that there's a possibility that, putting on your crystal ball, putting on your predicting hat and or looking into the crystal ball, do you think there's a possibility that those two things will need to converge?
I've always sort of hoped that they might, but I don't know if they really will, in the sense that although they do similar things, I think the needs of software developers and the needs of content developers aren't exactly the same. What I do think is that there needs to be good tools for having them communicate. They don't exist at the moment, to my knowledge. I've worked in places where they've been developed in-house, but I've not seen any out-of-the-box stuff that really, helps us integrate stuff, material that's in a CMS with a configuration management system. I would hope that some of these developers of these systems would start to think about doing that, because I think we're going to need that more and more.
There's another question here. In your experience, are there any problems with getting access to this text? And I think the context of that was the text that's embedded in the software.
I would say there's less and less in the way of obstacles or problems first of all, software development techniques tend to keep that text outside the hard code, so they're usually in external dictionaries, which are text files or XML files, which are fairly easy to edit and are not hard-coded into the software. There are still some legacy applications where you really have to go into the code to get at that stuff, and that's really tricky. I think most developers are really happy to have somebody else write this stuff, and they would love it if they don't have to. So that I think there are fewer and fewer problems getting access to it.
Okay. And you mentioned Agile and build automation, and just kind of as a side note on that, build automation is definitely something that we're seeing a lot of interest in here. Lots and lots of people are contacting us asking about how to do this. How do we make that having to build things step go away? So I definitely agree with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I've worked in places where it's been done, and very effectively. Generally for smaller projects so far. For huge projects, it's still a problem, but I think we're getting there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think that's it on the questions, unless somebody is frantically typing.
Okay. Shall we move on then?
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the next step, once you've got all this, or as much of it as you're able to produce, being practical, we get to creating the stuff, and the creation phase is where we write it. This is actually the part that I'm spending the least amount of time on, because I'm assuming that we're all experts on actually creating this stuff. We know how to write, but I did want to show an example of one piece of software that I've actually worked on. This is software for scheduling appointments in a dental office. And what you're seeing here is an in-progress screen, and it's a bit of a composite. Obviously, there's not real patient information in here, and so on. But what you see, can you see my mouse pointer?
Yes.
Are you able to see that?
You might want to slow it down, but we can see it.
Okay. Well, right here where my mouse pointer is, is a kind of mini patient card. These mini patient cards come up as a result of a search. So you do a search that is an Apple-style type-as-you-go search. You start getting lists of lists that are comprised of these little mini cards. You find the patient that you're looking for. You pull that person out of the list. That mini card is now floating on top of your calendar, and you go to the date when you finally find an appointment for them, and then you can double click on the date, and that patient card is then fixed onto the appointment. We also have a system where the appointment itself, if you hover over it, produces a flyout. And this gives just slightly more information. This is the whole idea of progressive disclosure, which many of you have probably heard about or had some connection with. And as you see on this, you have a certain number of options here that you can click on that produce links, that produce other tools or other panels where the person can do a certain amount of work. Now, one thing which is not shown here because it wasn't done yet, but which is part of this, is a kind of help screen, which would be another panel that will just drop down below here and tell the user, give the user an overview of what you can do in this panel and provide a link to a more extensive help screen should they need it. So that the same, and this is the whole idea of coherence that I was talking about earlier, the same kind of progressive disclosure that is used in the software itself and in the information contained in the software doing its work is also contained in the user guidance. And this is the result, this was in fact the result of a very strong collaboration between information designers, interaction designers, technical communicators, and programmers. It took quite a while to get here, too, and we tried a lot of different things before arriving at this solution. But that was the result of the kind of team effort that we're talking about. Another thing that we were looking at was the question of why is it interesting to do this, the decision support, or what might you be doing next in the process. Now, everybody remembers with horror the Microsoft Clippy. Nobody wants anything like that. But what we thought was the notion that you might anticipate what the user might want to do next is not a dumb one. So how do we deal with that without being obnoxious? And what we came up with was the idea of these little yellow panels here, quite discreet, and which can be turned off easily without having to go through a huge process, that just say, this is what you might want to do next, or learn about, what you can do in this screen. And you see the same sort of thing actually on this patient panel here. So there are a variety of options that are there. And the time in which I left this project, it wasn't yet decided just how much of this we were going to do, but we were pretty sure that we were going to do some of it. So these are just some examples from real life, from real projects of how these ideas that I've been talking about can be applied, and that is part of the creation phase. I'm going to end up here with just a summary of the deliverables that are necessary for the governance phase. Governance essentially is the stewardship and evaluation of your content, and that's how you maintain it in good order and help plan new releases, and even in between releases if your software is actually fetching live information from some place such as an extranet or a server in the cloud somewhere. So your deliverables at this phase will be the results of the metrics that you designed to apply to the content, which will tell you if the content is doing its job effectively. And these need to be measured against your business objectives. Usability tests. You should do usability testing. It's actually not that expensive or not that difficult to do usability testing. And do usability testing on your content, not just on the software interaction model, but on the content itself. Find out if your content is really user-friendly. Is it communicating what you need it to communicate, and can it be found by the users? You also need to take care of your metadata. Technology changes, terminology changes, and the metadata needs to evolve with it. That's really important if your searches are going to be useful. You're also going to, in your governance phase, determine what new content might be needed either for the next release or in between releases. And part of your governance is cleaned content, which needs to be archived or saved in some way or other. So I've provided here a bibliography, which are fairly standard sources, and you'll be able to access this from the recording. These are all fairly standard sources on web content strategy. You probably know some of these, and they're very useful to adapt to strategizing content for software. It's not a great stretch to go from web work to software work. And a lot of these same people are now starting to think about software as well. And another person who's really given a lot of thought to this sort of stuff, is Rahel Ann Bailey, and her blog at intentionaldesign.ca is also a really valuable source. So that's my presentation. I'm available here for any comments, questions, discussions, or anything else that you might want to add to this subject.
So I have a question. Given he sounds concerned, and I'll ask this while I'm waiting for the other questions to come in from the attendees. We obviously have limited resources. Just, it's just an axiom of life. So given a situation where there are known deficiencies in the technical documentation, I'm looking at it as a writer and saying, well, there's some issues over here, there's some issues over here, there's some things that I know need to be fixed and are under my control. Do you pursue that? Do you sort of put your head down and deal with the known issues that you can control and address, or do you stick your neck out and do this sort of strategy work, which is going to require collaboration with other parts of the organization, whatever it may be, that I may or may not have a whole lot of influence over?
Well, that's a really tough question, and of course a lot of it depends on your status inside the organization, whom you're able to influence, and how you can move things forward. But I would say that if you can work on the strategy, you will probably go a long way to helping that other problem as well. Whereas if you just deal with the one problem, you're going to get another one problem that's going to spring up some other time, because things are still being done in silos, and it's breaking the silos that we need to concentrate on as much as possible, as long as that doesn't stop us from delivering what we have to deliver. And I mean, that's practical, as you said. We do have limitations. We can only go so far, but we should push the envelope as hard as we can.
Generally, can you address the issue of interaction between developers, QA, and writers, and what kinds of things tend to work there?
Yeah, sure. Generally, I would say the best way. Obviously, if you're doing Agile, and if your team really buys into Agile, then obviously, as a content creator, you're already part of the Agile development team. So you've already got a certain you've already got a certain entry that in a more traditional waterfall development situation you might not have. As a member of the team, what you really want to do, or at least my way of approaching it, is I just ask a lot of questions. Some of the questions are uncomfortable questions, but I ask tons and tons of questions. And some people have answers to those questions, and some people say, gee, I don't know, what do you think? And that gives you a chance to chime in. These are kind of non-threatening ways of showing that you have some expertise or some understanding of what it is that they do, and also showing that you respect that they have some understanding and expertise of what you do. Once you can build confidence like that, then it becomes much more of a free-for-all where anybody can talk about any subject. And the specialization comes when you get around to who's going to do it. But if anybody can talk about anything, then you're brainstorming and you're all just collaborating on getting a good idea to make a good product. Sometimes you do get up against toxic personalities. And toxic personalities are really difficult to handle. And I don't have a real good answer for toxic personalities except don't take the bait. Deal with the subject. Don't deal with the person. Stay on subject and talk about what's going to make this a great product. And I think I've found most developers, if you if you show them respect and they show you a certain minimum of respect, it's real easy to do this. It's a lot easier than some of us imagine before we go into it.
Okay, well, thank you. And I think with that, we will wrap things up here. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Ray. We'll see you on the next one.